Could Trump's big move on global tariffs backfire with the people that put him in the White House? And what have been the global consequences? We will discuss all of that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. I thought we'd start with a little challenge because our colleague Gary O'Donoghue is here from Washington. It's got a little transatlantic tariff twist. Well, basically like everything these days. Yeah. So today, on Thursday, as we're recording this episode, the government published its list of products that it might put tariffs on in a few months' time if it wants to retaliate against the US for the tariffs the US has put on the UK. And it is 417 pages long.
I spent too long today looking at this.
So the challenge is...
Oh, yes.
I'm going to Control F this document, and you have to come up with something that's not in this document.
Oh, that's
because it's got so many weird things.
417 pages.
And it's got things like parts for roller coasters.
I love the roller coaster.
Yeah. So,
okay,
Chris, name an item. It can be as normal or as weird as you like.
That is not in there.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is or not.
Okay.
Frisbee.
Oh, that's a good one. Isn't that a brand name? Would it not be like circular flying disc that can be used as a toy?
No Frisbee in there. So actually, Chris, you get a point. Well done. Gary, come up with a product and we'll see if it's on there.
I'm guessing Scotch eggs are not.
Scotch eggs. Again, though, I'm not sure if Scotch egg would be the name of it. I mean, there's lots of Scotch whiskey on there.
Obviously.
No,
egg encased in pork butter.
There's no Scotch egg, but there are 38 different egg references on there.
Michael Gove might do something about that.
Yeah, but that also includes Taleggio cheese. Right, okay, so sorry, no point for our visitor from Washington. But good effort, though.
No.
Flip-flop.
That's not, is that going to be called
that's
flip-flop?
a shoe. It's not a brand name, it's a shoe.
They don't call it.
There is
thong or a thong.
Thong, that's what they would, is that what they call
Australian.
flip-flops in
That's
America?
Australian. Yeah.
I don't.
Oh ho! Footwear with outer soles and uppers of rubber or plastics with upper straps or thongs assembled to the sole by means of plugs. So that is on there.
It's on there.
I can't remember the rules. Does that mean you lose or you win?
I don't.
I think
win.
you lose.
I think only Chris wins.
Only Chris wins. So congratulations. Do you know what? I'm just keeping looking up things in this tariff list. It's like a sort of twisted Argos catalogue. It's amazing. Anyway, right. Let's get serious though, because that tariff stuff is quite amusing. Looking up whether we're going to put tariffs on flip flops. But if you look at the financial markets today, the reaction to Donald Trump's announcement on Wednesday evening about a whole load of tariffs on every country in the world. It's been quite dramatic. The FTSE in the UK had its worst day since August last year, closed down 1.5%. The US market's down quite a lot as well. At one point, Apple's shares were down something like 8%. Chris, we caught up on Wednesday night after Donald Trump's quite big dramatic moment. How would you say the mood has shifted in the last 24 hours?
UK
People have come to terms with it, yeah.
So I think in the immediate minutes after Donald Trump had finished, there was palpable relief from people in government. They were desperate that it didn't appear like they were happy, because clearly you're not going to be when you've been whacked with tariffs. But they had feared worse, and they were aware of the comparisons, not least with the European Union. Then this morning, Thursday morning, Prime Minister had some affected businesses into Downing Street to talk about it. And then you got from the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, that backup plan that if they don't get a deal with America that helps improve, certainly in some areas, the trading relationship, then starting this process that runs for a month where they ask people for their views on the consequences for British businesses of retaliatory tariffs, not on Frisbees, but yes on Scotch eggs. Actually, no, it wasn't Scotch eggs, was it? Anyway, whatever it was. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the mood music here. But underlying all of that recognition that, here we go again with another element of hugely unpredictable potential economic strife.
And we'll talk a bit more in depth about the British reaction in a second. But Gary, I mean, you followed Trump on the campaign trail. Did you know exactly this was coming from observing every Trump speech of the last year?
I don't think he had to be on the... I mean, Trump has been talking about tariffs ever since he's been a public figure for decades.
Yeah, since the 80s, yeah.
I mean, he really thinks they are, an absolute, answer to everything. He sees them as a revenue raiser. He doesn't see there being a downside to them, And when you ask him about downsides, he was asked about the other day, would prices of cars go up? He said, I couldn't care less. And then he was asked, what about will productivity, rise in the US to fill the gaps? And he says, well, ultimately, the problem with American politics is incredibly short term by definition. Every member of the House is elected every 2 years. You can't wait for ultimately before potentially the voters start punishing you. And the one thing they haven't done amidst all this rhetoric and theatre that we saw in the Rose Garden, the one thing they haven't done is laid the groundwork with the American public saying there will be pain. Don't worry, there will be pain, but there will be gain. They don't seem to be doing that. That seems to be a bit of a miss.
I'm just so fascinated by that because there must be, like you say, everyone knew it was coming, right? He said, I love tariffs during the election campaign repeatedly. There's very few people that would have looked at Donald Trump on the campaign trail or since he's been in the White House and not expected something, even if they didn't know the detail. But I wonder how convinced you think people are, because it only seems to me today that we've heard a little bit from Donald Trump in his social media posts saying, it's like an operation when it takes a bit of time to get better, but it's worth it in the end. Or I think JD Vance recognised that there might be a bit of short-term pain, but I just wonder how much that's really sinking in, or how much sense you get that that's really sinking in publicly, that there might be a bite before, if you believe Donald Trump, things get better and it ends up like some sort of tariff utopia.
I don't think people do realise that. One of the car manufacturers today has already announced 900 layoffs of, albeit temporary hourly paid workers. But you can see once that starts to hit home around the country and other people start doing it, then it will become a reality in everyone will know someone who's been hit. But people have said, and you see them interviewed sometimes saying, I don't mind inflation going up for a little bit because I think he'll do it he'll sort me out in the long run. But I don't think, the American consumer is already massively stretched. They're paying, more than $1,500 more for their monthly groceries than they were 2 or 3 years. They are being hammered. And if this is going to hammer them even further, they're not going to like it.
But what are the incentives for Trump here? Because he's not facing re-election. So actually he could annoy literally everyone, every single person in America, and it wouldn't make any difference to his future.
No, I think that's true. It is, promises made, promises kept, as he said on election night. It's incredibly important to him. He believes this is a flex. This is not just an economic policy. This is a national security policy, a policy about national pride. He said yesterday, this is America's declaration of economic independence. So, next year, 250th anniversary of the declaration, he sees it as much of a historic moment as that. The problem is, in such an interconnected world, remaking those relationships, reshaping that balance, even if you're the hegemon, can't be done overnight.
I think what's been interesting for me is just watching everybody scrabbling in real time to understand what's going on. Because normally in international diplomacy and trade policy, we've all heard about the Sherpas and like how meetings are prepared in advance. Yeah. And Chris, I'm just thinking back to you last night and conjuring up that image of Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, watching the BBC News channel like we all were and trying to pause it when Trump held up the big card with all this to work out where the UK was. And you could, at one point you couldn't see because the lectern was in the way of the UK. And you're like to think that actually the person in charge of British trade policy was doing the same.
And that is exactly how it played out. So alongside the theatre that was there for all to see with the president and that bit of cardboard and all of that stuff, and various numbers hiding behind the lectern, was the business secretary in front of a telly. They got wind that there was a kind of, as it was put to me, a good camp and a bad camp in terms of countries and the fate that they would find out, but they did not know what it would mean. And they're watching it on the telly like anybody else around the world. And an additional point along all of that, because there's sort of two strands to the story today in the UK context. One is the whole business of that list of things that could be tariffed in return. The other thing is the discussion that's going on to try and get a deal with Washington. And someone was saying to me, it just didn't feel like a normal trade negotiation. In other words, things that just take forever and fought over in a minute, detailed way, and with all sorts of conventions around diplomacy. And as you say, not necessarily in this instance, but the Sherpas, the diplomats, and blah blah blah, the kind of conventions, the niceties of normal debate and discussion on these things, which takes forever. They said on the UK side it felt like dealing with a corporate entity, and that speaks to the biographies of the people.
What, in the sense of?
Well, in the sense of the as they put it, the biographies of the people they're dealing with.
Kind of less protocol stuff.
Exactly.
Let's do a non-paper circulation amongst the principals. All that stuff.
Exactly, all of that, and it happening at an incredible pace compared with how these things would normally happen. Just to conclude that thought, they think they're making lots of progress, but because they are dealing with the Trump administration, they can't be certain of anything until it finally lands on the president's desk. And even if the people they're dealing with are acting in good faith, does that necessarily translate to a deal that the president would want to sign off? That remains a big question.
But are we going to see the return of tactical Trump, who just wants to do deals? Because actually you read the paperwork around this tariff policy, and there are exemptions for certain items, which makes you think, oh, there might be some wriggle room there. And also he has reserved the right to lower this 10% global tariff on particular people or particular products if he wants to. He's given himself quite a lot of power to do deals on this stuff.
He has, and bear in mind, in the run-up to all this, the figures that were being talked about over the last few months have varied wildly. So it is perfectly possible that he will reverse on certain things, try and do side deals with other things. I mean, he will not react well, for example, to the Canadians who, came out absolutely swinging in their reaction today. That will not go down well. We know the history that's been there over the last few months. But he's, the level of rhetoric that he used, I mean, it even shocked me, having listened to this for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, looted, pillaged, raped and plundered these foreign scavengers and scoundrels.
Isn't that just classic Trump, or do you think that's it up a notch on even him?
I do a bit. I mean, I think there's rhetoric, and then there's pillaged and raped.
Well, yeah, he used to use that sort of language for immigrants from South America, didn't he? But to then apply it to his allies. Yeah.
I thought it was extraordinary.
Also,
and
Alex,
a bit offensive, to be honest.
It's been a great geography lesson as well, because we've been learning about all sorts of places we'd never heard of that have trade
you need to find the
relationships with
remote
America.
islands in the Antarctic that are suddenly slapped with a tariff, even though they're only inhabited by penguins and seals.
But which subverts Keir Starmer's argument that he was doing the right thing by negotiating with the Trump administration. Because actually, as Nick Robinson said on the Today programme, if an island with 10 penguins on it gets the same level of tariffs as the UK, that doesn't speak volumes about the UK's negotiating ability.
It's interesting because there's been a bit of a move, I think, from the immediate reaction after Donald Trump announced the tariffs, when the UK government saw that 10% rate and were very much like, aha, our softly approach has paid off a little bit, to then seeing the full list of the other places that have also got a 10% rate.
I know this sounds slightly facetious, but those penguins haven't been on the telly slagging him off either, have they? In other words, they've also not been drawing attention to themselves in the way that some countries that have decided for their own domestic political reasons to be a lot more robust publicly.
The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, was still making the case when he stood up in the House of Commons to address MPs about this, that he thought the UK government's approach had been vindicated by the fact that it wasn't a bigger tariff on the UK. Although the Conservatives were very quick to say, hang about, you haven't got any special treatment because look at all the other countries with a 10% tariff. And I think they quoted Christmas Island and Kosovo and others as well, So there's a kind of political argument about how much credit the government's approach can take. But I think what is interesting in terms of the UK government's response is kind of two key points. The first one is that despite the fact that they are very keen, and I think still sound quite optimistic about the notion of getting some sort of deal, and Jonathan Reynolds again talking about the fact of getting rid of these tariffs as a possibility altogether, despite that, they have strengthened their response with this idea about at least they're starting a process of consulting on what retaliatory tariffs may look like. So I think that was quite an interesting thing. And the second bit about it is, what if they don't get an economic deal? And at what point does the questions over the approach they've chosen to take, which is softly, don't antagonise, maintain relationships, at what point do people start to say, hang about, what are you actually getting back for that?
And also, I was going to ask you this, Gary, to what extent the 10% baseline, as opposed to deals about various other things, whether it might be metals or cars or other non-tariff elements of a trade deal. How much of that 10% baseline is, as far as the Trump administration are concerned, a kind of baked-in revenue source in order to allow him to cut taxes?
Yeah, I mean, 10%, there are going to be some industries that feel they can absorb that, right? And there are going to be some consumers in the States that don't mind paying 10% on things that are quite cheap because it's not going to feel that hard. And he does need money because they're trying to push through and these tax cuts that came in his first term, they're trying to make them permanent. And they promised not to cut Social Security or Medicare. And at the moment, there's a big black hole and question mark, whatever you want to call it, over how you're going to fund all that. One thing I was going to ask you is, clearly the Starmer government here has got room to manoeuvre because of the Tories' attitude. They're giving them space to manoeuvre, aren't they? A lot of other countries have got oppositions that are clamouring for a response, for a robust response. But you're not getting that here, right?
No, and it is interesting that the Conservatives are of the view pretty much in line, really, with where the government is.
Because they're a free trade party.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. On the fundamentals that they agree, they've tried to find little bits of space where they were making that point, weren't they, about as they would see it, a kind of Brexit dividend here, that the tariff is lower than if we'd been in the European Union. But and even the Liberal Democrats, who have been tempted to sound a bit more robust in Donald Trump's direction because they know that the government can't and the Conservatives won't really. Even they have tempered it a little bit. They talk about potentially working with European partners around retaliatory tariffs, but not saying put them on instantly.
But because this is happening everywhere around the world simultaneously, there are already examples of people doing different things. You hinted at it there, Gary.
Yeah.
Like Emmanuel Macron did a speech Thursday afternoon, way tougher than Starmer, and talking about people getting together. So, well, hang on. France and the UK have been speaking as one voice when it comes to Ukraine and policing a peace deal. Maybe there's going to be pressure to start having joint summits about this stuff.
And Australia have said they're not going to respond with tariffs as well, I think.
And then the Spanish Prime Minister this afternoon doing a speech saying they're making COVID-style loans available to businesses who are affected. So you can see there's lots, because it's happening everywhere all at once, there are lots of examples that if people do want to start pressurising Keir Starmer or criticising him, there's quite a lot of evidence on the shelf.
What's the basis, though, for the UK government's optimism about a trade deal? Because we've been here so many times before, and, when they end up doing the sector-by-sector stuff, there are so many problems, whether you look at agriculture. I know that, agriculture is the big one everyone always talks about, chicken and beef and whatever. But there's also things that stumbled last time, like access to the healthcare sector here, which are huge hot potatoes domestically.
So what's interesting on this deal is how the briefing about its scale has broadened quite a lot since I last saw you, Gary, in Washington when the Prime Minister was over there meeting the President just over a month ago. And the briefing then was that it would be really quite narrow and the emphasis was on technology. The briefing now is that it'll be quite a bit broader. Now, Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary, ruled out anything to do with healthcare and the NHS today. In fact, he was asked a question by Jeremy Corbyn, of all people, about that. But the indications I'm getting is that it will be broader, but quite how broad, quite how deep, and is it actually achievable? And I suppose if you are negotiating and the negotiations are still going on, you've kind of got to say you're optimistic. I mean, I think they genuinely are, by the way. I think they genuinely are. But you've also, I think, kind of got to say.
And it's also worth saying that whatever is on the table, and we certainly think the tech sector and taxes on some of the big tech giants are on the table, already that's potentially proving contentious with people lining up here ready to kind of say that's the wrong approach. So I don't think there's any way of doing it that's going to not involve a trade-off.
But look at this digital services tax, which sounds like is going to get scrapped to appease Washington in this trade
or eased or tweaked
or delayed or unimplemented. That's like a modern thing like that you have in the global economy in 2025. The chicken and the beef stuff seems a little bit kind of 90s and noughties.
And the thing, of course, worth remembering is that whilst we're talking about tariffs, we're focusing on goods, but the vast majority of trade between the US and the UK and the other way is services. So where in that space, as Gary is hinting, is there room for regulatory change, alignment, whatever it might be, where they could, if they reach a deal, point to an improvement in the trading conditions for businesses on either side.
Trump never talks about services. It's really
Right.
interesting. I mean, he's just interested. Sounds like he's just interested in widgets and things like that. And, you know, I mean, if you go back to the 70s in the States, 25% of people were employed in manufacturing. It's now 8%. He thinks he can reverse that. And, I mean, it's an extraordinary ambition. But it also belies the fact, of course, that, you know, even if you start building stuff in the States, I think something like 40% of, you know, stuff that's made in the States has components from outside, which attract tariffs.
Just to zoom in on a particular bit of the UK, Alex, you were in Northern Ireland recently. Any intel from there? Because, of course, Northern Ireland already has like a slightly unique trading relationship with the EU, with Ireland, is also got the Brexit deal hanging over it as well.
Yeah. And 2 weeks ago I was there, and I think even at that stage there was an awful lot of concern about what the unique position of Northern Ireland would mean when it came to tariffs. And now we know the detail. What it obviously means is that there are two separate tariff regimes on the island of Ireland. So for the Republic of Ireland, I mean, this is really quite significant because they are a big exporter to the US. So they will be really significantly impacted as a member of the EU by the 20% tariffs. But then that also means in Northern Ireland, you've now got a different tariff regime of 10% because they're a member of the UK. There is also concern about what then would happen if the EU decides to retaliate because of Northern Ireland's unique position as a result of the post-Brexit trading arrangements, which means it still has to follow some EU rules. Would Northern Ireland have to then impose retaliatory tariffs along with the EU, which means that there could be a different regime in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So there are huge amounts of... There's just massive concern about what this all means for post-Brexit trading and the situation there.
Because, you know, depending on your point of view, as luck would have it, or sod's law, you know, what is the element of the European Union that Northern Ireland remains a part of post-Brexit? The single market for goods.
Yeah.
And so, if the tariffs that the EU impose, retaliatory tariffs the EU impose, are in any way different from the ones the UK does, which is highly likely even if the UK does retaliate because of how complex the coding is on trade and all the rest of it, what a scenario. And we're back to our old friend / foe, the border in the Irish Sea.
Well, like somebody put it today, it could be that if you're importing something from the US into Belfast, it's a completely different regime to if you're importing it into Bolton. And I think that is, you know, obviously politically going to become really quite challenging.
And then does it become enough of an issue for the British government? It has to pull the infamous Article 16 in the Brexit deal, which means that the Northern Ireland Protocol, that hard-fought, angsted thing, doesn't apply in Northern Ireland, and that caused a massive crisis when the EU tried to do it over COVID. Oh, so much to think about. And do you not remember, actually, I'm now thinking back to my analogy about, the modern economy is more about AI and pharma. Do you remember an era when people said, tariffs and trade don't really matter anymore because it's all about services and things?
But not only were people saying it all about services and things, which obviously was only true up to a point, but there was also that sort of assumption that the inevitable arc as far as trade was concerned was towards freer trade, broadly speaking, which there was a fair amount of evidence of for quite a while until
it was
last
settled,
night.
Wasn't it? It was a settled argument.
Yeah.
Anymore.
Gary, what do you think is the next frontier for Trump? Because he's obviously massively tried to shake up just how the federal government works in America with all those sackings and all those budget cuts via Doge. He's now shaking up like the global trading order in goods. What do you think he might want to shake up next?
Well, mass deportation is obviously the big one. And some of that's got bogged down in the courts, particularly with this sort of bizarre situation with the Venezuelan gang that he was trying to send off to the El Salvador jail.
So what was that all about?
So, I mean, this is an extraordinary story because, you know, he invoked this Enemy Aliens Act, which has only been used, I think, twice before in the...
And very controversially.
Yeah, very controversial. And it effectively gives the president a lot of power just to say, don't like you, you're out of the country, bypassing any kind of judicial process whatsoever. And it was used controversially in the Second World War. But even then it had some review, whereas on this occasion, you know, he signed this thing on a Friday night, didn't tell anyone. These people were rounded up, about 200-300 of them, rounded up, put on planes. And by the time it was made public at 10 to 3 on the Saturday afternoon, the planes were already taxiing on the runways. There was a court then convening, the ACLU, the Civil Liberties people went to court. A judge said, turn these planes around. And then they said, nah, sorry, they're already outside a US airspace on their way to El Salvador. And so there's a whole, I mean, this has raised a whole debate about not just, the immigration and the deportation strategy, but whether the administration is actually going to follow the rulings of courts. And, once you're into that kind of territory, and I know there's a lot of rhetoric about this sort of thing, but once you're into that kind of territory, you're into serious constitutional questions. And it does show, that you may have these 3 branches of government in America. I mean, they call them co-equal. They're not co-equal, but, there's 3 branches of government. But at the end of the day, which branch controls armies and things? It's not the judiciary. So what can they do?
Right.
What can they do? And if you've survived 2 impeachments, which is the only way of getting rid of a president other than an election, then what?
You don't have another election to face.
No. What is the price you pay? Not much.
Right. But Gary, I'm just thinking back to that earlier conversation we had, and all the time you spent with those MAGA fans at those rallies, and if their hero is making them poorer and the price of everything more expensive and the country feeling less safe, what happens then?
Yeah, I mean, they will put up with a lot because they think there is an Eden down the road. The price of eggs has come down by 50%, so they're happy about that. But this is a project. This is not something where individual inconveniences is going to put them off. I think there are bigger things that, I mean, inflation will be one thing. If there's persistent high inflation and people start losing jobs as well, then eventually pocketbook issues touch everyone. The thing I think will, and I'm surprised this hasn't really been talked about very much, but with the deportation stuff, Donald Trump has raised his support among Hispanic voters massively. I mean, really massively. If you are really going to deport millions, most of these will be deportations to South and Central America. Eventually, your aunt, your uncle, is going to get a knock on the door. And I think, everyone loves summary justice until they're on the sharp end.
Yeah, but it's someone else.
People love strong government. Some people even love autocratic government until they get the 2:00 knock.
Right.
And then I think that's when, the rubber will hit the road, as it were. But we're not there yet.
Sorry to end on a less magisterial note, but you said a word there and I've actually never known what it means, but I've used it myself. Pocketbook. What is a pocketbook? Is it just like another word for like purse?
It's like a really old-fashioned word for a wallet.
Right.
Sorry.
Oh, well, there we go.
Americanized.
I sort of assumed that's what it was, but then I was like, do they have like a special thing in America we don't have here? Are we going to put tariffs on pocketbooks?
Well, of course, Congress.
Actually, that brings us back to where we started. Are we going to put tariff on purses?
Well, Congress has the power of the purse, of course.
Yes, there's potentially going to be retaliatory tariffs on wallets, purses, key pouches, cigarette cases, tobacco pouches, and similar articles carried in the pocket or handbag with outer surface of leather, composition leather, or patent leather.
I mean, come on.
Gary, lovely to see you. Safe travels.
Thank you so much.
And lovely to catch up with you too as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.